Have you ever wondered how a single 911 call could change someone's life forever? A black teenager walks through an affluent neighborhood. A woman sees him and feels uneasy. Moments later, a group of police officers arrives, all because of an unnamed fear. But what happens when the truth is revealed? And who is the real threat? It was a late afternoon in Hawthorne Heights, an upscale neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina. Luxury homes lined the pristine streets, where expensive cars glided smoothly under the golden sunset. Everything seemed to be in perfect order, or at least, that's what people believed. 16-year-old Jordan Carter had just finished basketball practice at his high school. With a heavy gym bag slung over his shoulder, he walked through the neighborhood, music playing through his headphones, unaware that he was being watched. Behind the softly swaying curtains of a nearby home, Margaret Sinclair squinted out the window. She had lived here for nearly 20 years, memorizing every familiar face in the neighborhood. But this boy, he didn't look familiar. He was alone, glancing around as if he were scouting something. A sense of unease crept over her. Should she call the police? What if she did nothing, and something happened? Margaret took a deep breath, picked up her phone, and dialed 911, setting in motion a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Margaret Sinclair's finger hovered over her phone screen, hesitating for a split second before pressing the call button. She didn't want to think of herself as that kind of person, the kind who made assumptions about people based on their skin color. But a small voice in her head whispered, "What if something happens?" When the dispatcher picked up, Margaret lowered her voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. "I'd like to report a suspicious person in the neighborhood," she said, her eyes locked on the teenager outside. "Can you describe the individual?" Margaret swallowed hard. "He's tall, black, wearing a hoodie, carrying a bag." She paused, then added, "He keeps looking around, like he's scoping out the houses." The dispatcher's tone remained neutral. "Is he doing anything illegal?" Margaret hesitated. The truth was, the boy hadn't done anything wrong. He was just walking, but the uneasy feeling in her chest wouldn't go away. "Not exactly, but he doesn't belong here." That was enough. The dispatcher informed her that a patrol car would be sent to check it out. Margaret ended the call, but the tension in her stomach remained. Outside, Jordan Carter kept walking, oblivious to the watchful eyes peering at him from behind the curtains. He paused briefly to change the song on his phone, inhaling deeply after an exhausting basketball practice. Home was only a few blocks away. But minutes later, a sharp, all too familiar sound cut through the air, the wail of a police siren. Jordan flinched and turned around. A patrol car sped toward him, stopping abruptly just a few feet away. Two officers, Officer Harris and Officer Blake, stepped out, hands resting near their holsters, eyes scanning him with suspicion. "Stop right there," Harris commanded. Jordan pulled out his earbuds, eyes wide, his heartbeat suddenly pounding in his ears. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with confusion. Blake's gaze shifted to the gym bag slung over Jordan's shoulder. "What's in the bag?" Jordan frowned. "Basketball gear. I'm just heading home." Harris narrowed his eyes. "Where do you live?" Jordan opened his mouth to answer. But before he could, Blake reached out and yanked the bag off his shoulder. "Hey, that's mine," Jordan protested, instinctively grabbing for it. "Relax," Blake said, while Harris unzipped the bag and started rifling through it. Basketball, sneakers, a sweat-drenched jersey. Nothing unusual, but the suspicion in their eyes didn't waver. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Harris pressed, his tone sharp. A tight knot formed in Jordan's chest. Should he tell the truth, that this was just a shortcut home? Or would that make things worse? He didn't get a chance to decide. From down the street, a sleek black SUV came barreling toward them at an unusually high speed. The car screeched to a halt. The door swung open, and out stepped a woman, her every move exuding authority and power. In that instant, both officers realized they might have just made a serious mistake. The sleek black SUV screeched to a halt at the curb. The door swung open, and out stepped a woman, composed, deliberate, exuding authority. Dr. Olivia Carter, Jordan's mother, didn't need to shout or rush forward. She moved with the kind of razor-sharp poise that belonged to someone accustomed to commanding attention in boardrooms, courtrooms, and spaces where people had to listen when she spoke. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, her tailored suit pristine, and the heels of her shoes clicked against the pavement with a steady, unwavering rhythm. But it wasn't her presence alone that shifted the atmosphere, it was her gaze. Cold, calculated, piercing. Jordan exhaled, relief washing over him. His mother had arrived just in time. Harris and Blake exchanged glances. They didn't yet recognize her, but they felt the weight of who she was. This was no ordinary mother. "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Harris said, his voice measured, still attempting to maintain control of the situation. "We're handling something here." Olivia didn't stop. She barely even slowed down. Her eyes flicked to her son, his bag being rummaged through, and the two officers with their hands still hovering near their holsters. "Handling what, exactly?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried undeniable weight. Jordan started to speak, but Olivia lifted a hand, a silent command. "I've got this, son." Blake cleared his throat. "We received a report of a suspicious individual in the area. He matched the description, so we had to check." "Suspicious?" Olivia cut him off, her tone icy. "A teenager walking with a gym bag is suspicious?" Harris held his stance, trying to appear unfazed. "We were just following protocol." Olivia nodded slowly, as if processing his words. Then, without another word, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it around for them to see. Displayed on the screen was Jordan's student ID, their home address, and a picture of them together at a recent community event. The silence that followed was heavy. Harris and Blake said nothing. "This is my son. He lives here. He has every right to walk down this street without being treated like a criminal," Olivia stated, her words cutting like a blade. "Now, you're going to give me a valid reason why you searched his bag without cause, or should I be calling the chief of police directly?" Blake swallowed hard. His earlier certainty wavered. Harris, still trying to hold his composure, felt the pressure mounting. Then, Olivia turned her head, her gaze locking onto a house nearby. Behind the window, Margaret Sinclair stood frozen, her face drained of color. She had recognized the woman now. She had called the police on Dr. Olivia Carter, one of Charleston's most prominent attorneys. And now, all she could do was stand there and watch everything unravel. The air was so thick with tension it felt like it could be sliced with a knife. Harris and Blake stood frozen, exchanging uneasy glances. For the first time that night, they weren't sure if they were in control anymore. Olivia remained exactly where she was, her sharp gaze locked onto the two officers. She didn't need to raise her voice. Every word she spoke carried the weight of someone who knew the law better than anyone standing there. "You still haven't answered my question," she said, her tone slow but unyielding. "Why was my son stopped? And who decided that his presence was suspicious?" Harris blinked, opening his mouth to respond. But before he could, another voice cut through the silence. I did." All heads turned. Standing at the entrance of her home, Margaret Sinclair looked like the blood had drained from her face. Gone was the poised, affluent woman of Hawthorne Heights. In her place was someone who appeared shaken, unsure, and, above all, suddenly aware of the weight of her actions. Olivia folded her arms, her gaze unwavering as she looked straight at the woman who had called the police on her son. "You thought my son was a threat?" Margaret swallowed hard. I just thought." "You thought what?" Olivia cut in. "That a black boy carrying a gym bag had to be a thief? That he couldn't just be walking home?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Olivia's words reflected back at her, forcing her to confront the unspoken fears she had never questioned. Jordan tightened his grip on his bag, feeling the slow burn of anger in his chest. He was used to suspicious glances, to people crossing the street when they saw him coming. But this was different. This time, he had watched a stranger define his very existence as dangerous. "Do you even realize how this could have ended?" Olivia pressed, her voice steady but edged with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "If I hadn't arrived, if my son had panicked, if one of these officers had decided he was a threat, then what?" Margaret looked down. She knew the answer, and that knowledge was suffocating. "I didn't mean," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. But even she knew those words were meaningless now. Harris cleared his throat, eager to regain some control. "If everything is fine here, we'll be on our way." Olivia let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's it?" she asked, her eyes filled with disdain. "You just leave, Without so much as an apology? Blake avoided her gaze, but Harris squared his shoulders. We were following protocol. Olivia shook her head. She had dealt with men like them before, men who used the word protocol to justify their implicit biases. Their split-second judgments that could cost people their dignity or their lives. She turned to Jordan, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Let's go, son. Jordan didn't need to be told twice. He turned, heading toward the SUV. But deep down, he knew, for him, for his mother, and for people like them, this wasn't over. The black SUV rolled away from the quiet streets of Hawthorne Heights. But inside Jordan, the weight of what had just happened refused to settle. He leaned his head against the window, staring out at the towering mansions, the perfectly manicured lawns, and behind the curtains, hidden yet ever present, the eyes that still watched him as if he were an outsider. In the driver's seat, Olivia Carter gripped the steering wheel tightly. Her gaze fixed ahead. She didn't speak, but the silence in the car was heavier than words. Finally, Jordan broke it. If you hadn't shown up in time, what would have happened? Olivia took a deep breath. The question cut straight through her. Sharp and unrelenting. She knew the answer but couldn't bring herself to say it aloud. I don't know, she admitted, her voice quiet, and I don't want to imagine it. Jordan nodded slowly. He thought about the way Officer Harris had looked at him, not as a person, but as a suspect. He had done nothing wrong. But did that even matter? Has this ever happened to you? He asked. Olivia let out a soft, bitter chuckle, not out of amusement, but because of the cruel irony of the question. Not just once, she said, and not just to me. Anyone who looks like us has been through it. Jordan clenched his fists, feeling a helpless frustration creeping into his chest. So what am I supposed to do? For the first time since they had left, Olivia turned to look at her son. Her eyes held a quiet strength, but beneath it was an aching sorrow. You keep living, you stay strong, and most importantly, you remember that this is not your fault. Jordan remained silent, unsure if he could fully accept that. Blank. Blank. Across the neighborhood, Margaret Sinclair still stood by her window. She had watched everything unfold from start to finish. Now, as the SUV disappeared into the distance, she realized that her hands were trembling. She hadn't meant to be racist. She didn't think of herself as a bad person. So why did she feel ashamed? She recalled the moment Olivia Carter had locked eyes with her and asked, "What were you thinking?" And the truth was, she didn't know. Had she believed she was protecting the neighborhood? Or had she merely been protecting her own nameless fears? Margaret swallowed hard, looking down at the phone still clutched in her hand, the same device she had used minutes ago to call the police on an innocent boy. A chilling thought crossed her mind. If his mother hadn't arrived in time, what would have happened? For the first time, Margaret realized she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Margaret sat on the sofa, her hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the phone resting on the coffee table. The spacious house, usually filled with soft classical music or the hum of evening conversations, now felt eerily silent, but in her mind, Olivia's words still echoed. What were you thinking? She had always prided herself on being educated, cultured, a supporter of the arts, and an active participant in charity events. She wasn't that kind of person. She wasn't racist. So why had she done what she did today? She couldn't deny the shame creeping up her spine. When she dialed 911, she had believed she was doing the right thing. But now, as she replayed the moment in her head, she realized she had never actually been afraid of Jordan, only of the idea that he didn't belong there. That thought unsettled her. She had read stories like this before, news articles about mistaken identities, about innocent black men and boys being confronted, arrested, even harmed for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But those stories had always felt distant, happening in other neighborhoods, in other cities. She had never imagined she would become part of one. Outside her window, Hawthorne Heights remained as pristine and orderly as ever. But to Margaret, something about it had changed. Blank. Across the city, in a home smaller but far warmer, Jordan sat in silence. His eyes were locked onto his gym bag on the floor, the one harmless object that, for no reason at all, had made him look suspicious today. The thing that had nearly turned him into a statistic. Are you okay? Olivia asked gently. Jordan exhaled. He wanted to say yes, But he wasn't sure if it would be true. Mom, his voice was quiet. Do you think, if I were white, this would have happened? Olivia's gaze softened, but the sadness in her eyes was unmistakable. No, she admitted, barely above a whisper. Probably not. The words tightened something in Jordan's chest. He had always known the world wasn't fair. But today, for the first time, he had felt it. This won't be the last time. Will it? He asked. Olivia shook her head. No, son, and that's why we have to keep fighting. Jordan nodded. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face a world that would always see him with suspicion first. But at least, he knew he wasn't alone. Blank. Blank. This story had ended better than so many others. But as Margaret sat there, wrestling with her delayed realization, as Jordan looked to his mother, knowing he would have to face this reality again and again, one question still hung in the air. Unanswered. How many more times will this have to happen before anything truly changes? The black SUV pulled up in front of the house. But Jordan didn't move to get out. He sat there, staring out the window, replaying everything that had just happened. He hadn't been arrested. He hadn't been hurt. But he couldn't call this a victory. Because he knew that somewhere, another boy might not be so lucky. Olivia remained in the driver's seat, her grip still firm on the steering wheel. She wanted to tell her son that things would get better. That one day, he wouldn't have to carry this weight. But she wasn't sure if that would be true. Are you angry? She asked softly. Jordan thought for a moment, then shook his head. No, he said, just tired. Olivia exhaled quietly. That was what she had feared the most, that her son would grow up learning to accept injustice before he even had the chance to fight it. Blank. Across the city, Margaret still sat by the window, staring at the phone in her hands. She could put it down. She could go about her life as if nothing had happened. But today, she couldn't. For the first time in her life, she asked herself, if I've been part of the problem, could I also be part of the solution? Blank. This isn't just Jordan's story. It's the story of thousands. How many other 911 calls have ended in something far worse than this? How many people like Margaret have made that call without ever questioning why? Maybe it's time we stop pretending this problem doesn't exist. Maybe it's time to do something about it.